Good evening, I'm Jim Lehrer. On the NewsHour tonight, a Terrence Smith look at the process and the results of newspaper endorsements in the presidential race. A campaign speech by Green Party nominee Ralph Nader, a summary of the turmoil in Ivory Coast by Ray Suarez, a report on life-saving machines called defibrillators by Susan Denser, and an Elizabeth Farnsworth conversation with Poet Laureate Stanley Kunitz. It all follows a summary of the news this Thursday.
Suppose there was a pill to help prevent heart disease and premature aging. There already is, natural vitamin E. Who supplies it to the world?
This program was also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
Governor Bush challenged Vice President Gore today on his leadership and honesty. And Gore said Bush was ignoring global warming. Bush campaigned in Pennsylvania. He charged the Clinton-Gore administration had meant 8 years of gridlock on vital issues. And he made indirect references to the 1996 fundraising scandal. He spoke in Pittsburgh.
When you govern by focus groups and act for interest groups, you cannot confront real problems in America. When you wait for the latest polls to point the way, you cannot lead. When you hold your finger to the wind, you cannot put your finger on a problem. And when you hold on to power for power's sake, you cannot govern. I believe when it's all said and done, America will realize my opponent's campaign is a fitting close to the Clinton-Gore years. They are going out as they came in. Their guide, the nightly polls. Their goal, the morning headlines. Their legacy, the fruitless search for a legacy. In my administration, we will ask not only what is legal, but what is right. Not just what the lawyers allow, but what the public deserves. In my administration, we'll make it clear there is the controlling legal authority of conscience.
Vice President Gore traveled across the Midwest, touting his environmental record. In Davenport, Iowa, he cited a United Nations report that said the world was warming faster than expected. And he said Governor Bush would only ignore that problem.
I know a lot of people say that looks like it's off in the future. Well, let me tell you what this new study said. Instead of just going up a few degrees, in the lifetimes of these kids, unless we act, the average temperature is going to go up 10 or 11 degrees. The storms will get stronger, the weather patterns will change. But it does not have to happen. And it won't happen if we put our minds to solving this problem. And that is one of the reasons I'm running for president. Here is the good news. If we take the leadership role that these kids have a right to expect us to play, we can create millions of good, new, high-paying jobs by building the new cars and trucks and furnaces and boilers and technologies to stop the pollution and lift standards of living at the same time. Are you with me? Governor Bush takes a different view. He wants to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to the big oil companies for a few months' worth of oil many years down the road. He says on global warming, he's not sure that what the cause is, and maybe we shouldn't do anything except just study it. Well, these kids have a right to expect that we will take responsibility for picking the hard right over the easy wrong, which turns out to be the best course, not only for the environment, but also for the economy. I need your help. I need your support. Let's do the right thing. Let's pick the hard right over the easy wrong.
Gore's message today was said to be aimed also at backers of Green Party candidate Ralph Nader. He's been drawing support from environmentalists and other activists in key states. We'll have excerpts from a Nader campaign speech later in the program tonight. Overseas today, there was word that at least 23 crewmen survived the initial explosions that sank the Russian nuclear submarine Kursk. One sailor left a message after the vessel went down in the Barents Sea last August. We have a report from Lindsay Taylor of Independent Television News.
For the relatives of the 118 men who died aboard the Kursk, there had been one comfort, the official assurance that it had all happened so quickly that virtually no one could have survived. But it wasn't true. A note found on one of the 4 bodies recovered so far from the destroyed submarine confirms that a fifth of the crew did survive the initial explosions that tore the vessel's forward sections apart. It was written by Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, commander of the vessel's turbine section, seen here in happier times. In total darkness, he managed to write an account describing how the survivors had made it to a rear compartment. He wrote, "All the crew from the 6th, 7th and 8th compartments went over to the 9th. There are 23 people here. None of us can get to the surface." During the mission to reach the Kursk, there was widespread criticism of the Russian authorities for delays of several days in accepting offers of international help. There were reports of tapping sounds from inside the submarine, but they were dismissed by Russian officials. But people had survived, only to die later. It's not known how much later, probably from drowning, hypothermia or high pressure. Russian Navy chiefs say the rest of the note was private for the seaman's family. They must now wonder whether, with a quicker rescue effort, the first divers might have found something other than bodies.
Russian President Putin promised again today to try to recover all of the bodies from the Kursk. In the Middle East today, a suicide bomber on a bicycle attacked an Israeli army post in the Gaza Strip. One soldier suffered minor injuries. The military said the bomber was a 24-year-old Palestinian. He rode up to the military post, hit a defensive wall, and blew himself up. The Islamic Jihad group claimed responsibility. It was the first such suicide bombing in a month of violence. There was chaos today in the Ivory Coast. Backers of President-elect Laurent Gbagbo fought with supporters of a rival. He had been excluded from last Sunday's presidential election, and he demanded a new vote. At least 25 people died in the fighting. Yesterday, the country's military ruler was ousted after he claimed he won the election. Gbagbo was formally proclaimed the winner today. We'll have more on this story later in the program tonight. Also coming, newspaper endorsements, a Ralph Nader speech, a machine that saves lives, and poet laureate Stanley Kunitz. Newspapers taking sides in the presidential race. Media correspondent Terrence Smith has the story.
In recent days, dozens of newspapers have endorsed either Vice President Gore or Governor Bush on their editorial pages. In what may be the closest presidential election in a generation, many editorial boards were divided before going to press. Sometimes they exhibited their own gender gap. On Sunday, the Seattle Times editorial page editor told readers she and her women colleagues on the editorial board were on the losing side of the endorsement debate. The paper, which had supported Senator Bill Bradley in the primary, sided with Governor Bush in the general election. In neighboring Oregon, another battleground state, the Portland Oregonian made a similar close call on the grounds that Bush had the intellect, character, fortitude, and talent to be a better president. However, unlike other Bush supporters, the paper defended Gore, saying he is not dishonorable or a liar, as Republicans have tried to portray him. Vice President Gore had some wholehearted backers, among them the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, which said he was prepared to lead in the right direction. Elsewhere around the country, the Columbus Dispatch in Ohio noted that Governor Bush believes that government should be the last resort, not the first, when problems must be solved. But the Seattle Post intelligencer said Gore's basic philosophy of active government is fundamentally more sound. A publisher's support is useful, but it has its limits. In 1936, Republican candidate Alf Landon won the great majority of editorial endorsements in the nation's newspapers, but was swamped at the polls by Franklin Roosevelt. For more on how and why newspaper editors are taking sides, we turn to four who have chosen a candidate in the last few days. Louisville Courier-Journal Vice President and Editorial Director David Hopp, Minneapolis Star-Tribune editorial page editor Susan Albright, Detroit News editorial page editor Nolan Finley, and Seattle Times publisher and CEO Frank Blethen, who is in San Francisco this evening. Welcome to you all. Frank Blethen, your paper supported Michael Dukakis in 1988, and you were the deciding voice this time to choose Governor Bush. Why?
Well, we think that the decision needs to be made based on somebody's background and their actual behavior. Gore is basically an incumbent, and we looked at issues of integrity, civility, honesty, philosophy of government, and in the Northwest, trade, and also education. And on those issues, it was overwhelmingly not Gore, and time for a change, and Bush is promising.
Mm-hmm. Susan Albright, why Vice President Gore for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune?
Well, this was not a difficult decision at all for us. We feel that Vice President Gore has a long record of achievement. We do not buy the rhetoric that he isn't a man of integrity. We think he has much more depth on the issues than his opponent, and we had no trouble at all coming out for Gore. In fact, I believe our editorials over the past months and years led inexorably to this endorsement.
Mm-hmm. Nolan Finley, your choice at the Detroit News, Governor Bush, why?
Well, we think Governor Bush will be a better steward of the economy. We think he's better equipped to manage this surplus. In many ways, a surplus is a more difficult challenge for a president than a deficit. There's a temptation to use the surplus to grow the government. We don't think Governor Bush will do that. And quite frankly, Vice President Gore scares us to death because of his radical environmental agenda. We think that'll cost Michigan jobs, particularly in the auto industry.
Mm-hmm. David Hopp, at the Louisville Courier-Journal, what was the overriding argument for Vice President Gore?
Well, I think experience certainly played the largest part, and we like Vice President Gore's experience. We are a sort of a New Deal Democratic paper. Some say our endorsement was fairly predictable since we have never endorsed a Republican for President of the United States. But we are a New Deal Democratic paper, and I think Al Gore not only is where we are on social issues and domestic policy, but in addition, and in a surprising turn in this election, it develops is much closer to where we are on defense and foreign policy. Mm-hmm. It was really surprising to me to find that Governor Bush was as thin as he is on defense and especially on foreign policy, and that he is as reluctant as he seems to be to assert American interests abroad and support democracy with American power abroad.
Mm-hmm. Frank Blethen, as we noticed in the setup, there was division on your editorial board at your paper as to the choice between the two candidates. Tell us a little about the process. I mean, did you debate it within the board? How do you do it?
Well, we debated it extensively in two different sessions. We have purposely created an editorial board that has some pretty strong differences of opinions and views. And on critical subjects like this and endorsements, we don't think we're doing our job if we don't have some difference of opinion. I think where we're different than a lot of papers is that not only do we encourage that internally, but then we encourage the editorial page editor to write columns and to share that with the readers and give them insights into both sides of the issues as well as our process.
Mm-hmm. How democratic, Frank Blethen, is this process, lowercase d here? In other words, were you as somebody whose family has controlled the paper for a long time, were you prepared to be outvoted?
Well, you know, it's as democratic, depends on how strong I feel about it and how strong the editorial page editor feels about it. A lot of issues we get full consensus and a lot of endorsements. The governor's endorsement, for instance, was unanimous consensus with the Democrat Gary Locke. But if the editorial page editor feels strongly enough about something, she might override a consensus, and I will do the same thing, although it doesn't happen that often.
Well, I mean, is the CEO's vote a little more equal than the others?
It sure is.
I would assume. Susan Albright at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, how do you do it? What's the process there?
Well, we have a group discussion. We talk about things over time, too. We take a great look at tradition and at our own current thinking. I think on our staff, we don't like to see a surprise endorsement. Somebody called it predictable. I think predictability isn't a bad thing in an endorsement because what it means is that you are building your credibility over time as a consistent voice. And so sometimes we have disagreements on endorsements, and what we do is work it through to the consensus point where the group can say, yes, we've reached a point that's right for this paper at this time in this race. And that's a little different from anyone exerting a certain kind of power or from voting. We don't do either of those.
And Susan Albright, does the management have a voice in this?
Oh, certainly. But our publisher really gives a lot of deference to our long-term stewardship, if you will, of the Star-Tribune's editorial traditions and philosophy.
Nolan Finley, what's the process in Detroit? Do you poll your board? Do you, what's the publisher's role? How does it work?
Well, we all sit down, including the publisher, and talk about the candidates. In this case, we invited both Governor Bush and Vice President Gore in for an editorial board. Governor Bush accepted, Vice President Gore declined. We discussed it, but really this was an easy one for us. We've been very much an opponent of Al Gore for a number of years, primarily because of his involvement with the Kyoto Accord and other things that we think just be bad for Michigan, bad for the economy.
Any dissension on your board at all?
Not on this one. Sometimes that happens, but this time we were fairly unanimous.
David Hopp, you mentioned that your paper has endorsed Democrats over the years. Does that, in your opinion, diminish the impact of an endorsement? Partly the point Susan Albright was making about consistency versus predictability?
Well, it does until that day comes when we do something different. Then that gives it tremendous impact. And you know, that day may come. As I look back over the endorsements our newspaper could have made back through history, I see at least one great big glaring mistake that we made. You know, we should have endorsed Teddy Roosevelt, but no, I don't think that. I don't know that it diminishes the impact, but it does give us the opportunity to surprise people and have a special impact when we do depart from what people expect from us, and that happens frequently in local elections. We, this time, for example, endorsed Republicans and were savaged for it, have been savaged for it by local Democrats and liberals who were very angry about it.
Right, you endorse Republicans at a state or local level?
We have often, and we did this time, and we really were given down the road by some of our traditional supporters as a result.
Frank Blethen, what was the reaction from your readers since you had supported a Democrat, Michael Dukakis, in the past, now a Republican? What was the reaction?
Well, the reaction was pretty strong on day one because we had a lot of people who I think had come to think that we were their voice. And the only thing that surprised me is how quickly people will forget the broader context and take one issue they disagree with. But there's really been two areas. Overwhelmingly, the division on our editorial board and what we're getting from the public is the choice issue. And it also, what we see is a huge gender gap. Women that are just simply unwilling to accept the question mark around Bush and choice, and men who are willing to, who want to change, and are willing to accept some unknowns around that issue. And in our case, since I've been involved heavily in the national effort to repeal the death tax, we got a lot of accusations from people who said that we're just doing this because Bush supports the death tax. And what those people are ignoring is in 9 Senate and congressional races in Washington State, we're probably going to end up endorsing 9 out of 10 Democrats, including endorsing against 3 Republicans who voted for death tax repeal and 2 Democrats who voted against it.
Mm-hmm. Susan Albright, Ralph Nader is said to be a significant factor in your state. Was it in your decision?
No, it wasn't in our decision, although we have been talking about what we might want to do about the fact that 8% of Minnesotans apparently are interested in Nader. And we've recently had several people coming from national organizations through the state all of a sudden because of this interest in Nader. Jesse Jackson was in town this week. A Representative Naral was in town. The Sierra Club was in town. All national leaders coming through.
What do you mean when you say you've been talking about what you might want to do about it?
Well, if you notice today, the New York Times had an editorial in which it was not an endorsement editorial at all. It was simply another editorial, but it was about the Nader run for the presidency and why they think that it was a bad idea for him to run in the first place and to stay in this long when it's clear that it's such a close race that he could have an effect on it.
Right.
So our board has been talking about Nader in those ways. We were not tempted to endorse him, but in fact might be tempted to say something about him in regard to possibly hurting Gore's chances.
The impact of a vote, in other
Yes.
words. Exactly. Nolan Finley, do endorsements matter anymore?
We see it as a guide for our readers. In a state like Michigan where the race is deadlocked, good number of people are still undecided. It's another tool for them to use. Hopefully we've built up some trust over the years with our readers. They know where we're coming from. But this is a tough one for Michigan. We've got a poll out tomorrow, shows the race still deadlocked at 42 points for each candidate. People here are having a tough time making up their minds. We hope that they'll find some of what we say about the candidates useful.
And possibly in a close race, it'll make more of a difference. Thank you very much. I want to thank all 4 of you.
Thank you.
And we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, a Nader speech, the Ivory Coast turmoil, a new life-saving tool, and Poet Laureate Stanley Kunitz. Now another in our ongoing series of campaign speeches by the leading presidential candidates. Tonight, Green Party nominee Ralph Nader speaking Monday night at Stanford University in California.
Let's examine these 2 candidates briefly. George W. Bush's motto is "Leave no child behind," which is about all he's done in Texas. Second highest child hunger and highest toxic pollution exposure to Texans of any state in the nation. He's turned over pollution control enforcement to the polluters in return for huge campaign contributions. He's a great corporate welfare king, turning a $600,000 borrowed investment into a $14 million profit in the Texas Rangers baseball team after his corporate buddies got the city of Arlington to build a new stadium with tax dollars. Inflated the team's value, he sells out for $14 million. His only business success. Al Gore is a more interesting character. On any given day, I can't figure out whether he's the great imposter or the great pretender. You look at all his promises and insights in his book, Earth in the Balance, you'll never meet a politician who's broken more of them or turned his back on more of them. Blind ambition, just no doubt about it. He will go with the power flow. Here's a man who wanted solar energy. He's never made a speech on it in 8 years. That really takes guts, you know, to make a speech for renewable energy, solar photovoltaics, and renewable solar thermal, and wind power, and such political fortitude. I mean, go down in one of the profiles of courage in American political history. You can be part of a very exciting, very productive political effort. At this stage, you'll be pioneers And there are some people who are pioneers, some people who are not. We're going to get millions of votes on November 7th as a launching pad for expanding this political movement in future elections. But right away, we have won in a variety of ways. We have tens of thousands of people coming in progressive political activity, including many, many thousands of young people on college campuses. We want to appeal to the idealism of youth, for one reason, for the idealism of youth that has been turned off by a political system that young people say is nothing more than all about money and lying. Money and lying. 34% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted in 1996. That's the lowest since 18-year-olds got the right to vote almost 30 years ago. We want you back into the political movement. If you ever hear a fellow student say, "I'm not turned on politics," give that student a history book, because if you don't turn on politics, down to the air you breathe, the water you drink, the racial profile you detest, the health insurance many people don't have, and on, if you don't turn on politics, politics will turn on you in very disagreeable ways. 1 million Americans offering 100 hours a year of volunteer time and raising $100, given the depth and breadth of this Green Party platform out of the Denver Convention in June, will make this party a majoritarian contender in a very few years. All kinds of talent is coming out of the woodwork because of this campaign. All kinds of people of all ages who had given up as part of the peace movement, or given up as part of the environmental movement, or given up as part of the inner city revitalization efforts. They're not giving up, they're coming in. We don't want future generations to look back on us and say ours was a generation that refused to give up so little in order to achieve so much. This may be the last generation that has that indulgence. We want future generations to look back on us and say, here was a generation that utilized its time in an important fashion, applied its talent in a productive fashion, and defined justice as the great work of human beings on earth. Here was a generation that stood tall, a generation that brought the world environmental justice, peace, disarmament, democracy, and the opportunities of all people to make the most of their lives. Here was a generation that looked destiny in the eye and said, we're going to meet it. Thank you.
Now the demand for democracy in Ivory Coast. Ray Suarez narrates our report.
For the third straight day, demonstrators filled the Ivory Coast capital of Abidjan, where recent violence has claimed at least 50 lives. The clashes are part of a three-way power struggle in a country that until recently was one of Africa's economic and political success stories. Ivory Coast, which declared independence from France in 1960, is the world's largest cocoa producer and a destination for economic migrants from nearby countries. The recent turmoil dates back to December, when the country's military leader, General Robert Gueye, staged a bloodless coup. He promised to end the corruption of his predecessor and to hold democratic elections. The elections were held Sunday, after the general's allies on the Supreme Court barred two of the strongest opposition parties. Early returns showed him behind, but on Tuesday, General Gueye dissolved the election commission and claimed victory in a four-way race.
The President of the Republic has decided to dissolve the National Electoral Commission, and we were asked to proclaim the results of the elections.
But that same day, the main opposition leader on the ballot, Laurent Gbagbo, claimed he had won, accusing the general of fraud. Thousands of supporters of the opposition took to the streets in multiple locations, declaring the vote unfair and undemocratic. By Wednesday, several key military leaders took their side and engaged in gun battles with government forces. In parts of the city, the government troops were clearly outnumbered and stayed out of the way. Yesterday, the pro-opposition crowds took over the TV and radio stations, and Gbagbo declared himself president.
I was leading in the election. General Gaye wanted to take power by force. I asked you to go to the streets, and you did that, and I want to thank you for that.
As for the general, he's believed to have fled the country. But today, another politician entered the fray, Alassane Dramane Ouattara. Widely considered the most popular opposition candidate, is calling for new elections. He had been disqualified from Sunday's vote on grounds that his parents are natives of the neighboring country of Burkina Faso. Many of his supporters boycotted the election to support him. And today, more than 1,000 of them held their own protest, smashing cars and setting up roadblocks. Earlier today, they reportedly clashed with allies of the new president. Meanwhile, the army, which is supporting the newly installed regime, has declared an overnight curfew until Monday morning.
And late today, the new president said he will form a, quote, unity government with other parties, but he will not call another election. Portable defibrillators can help save lives. That's the finding of 2 studies released in today's New England Journal of Medicine. Susan Denser of our health unit has been looking into a larger national study on the benefits of this new lifeline. The unit is a partnership with the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation.
Clear. The shot from a heart defibrillator is a familiar scene in TV medical melodramas, like the hit show ER.
300, come on, buddy, stay with me. Riley, get the hell out of the way, move. Clear.
Now the use of such devices to treat cardiac arrest could become a feature of everyday life. They're called automated external defibrillators, or AEDs, and portable versions could soon be coming to public places near you. That includes sports stadiums, shopping malls, and train stations like New York's Grand Central. There, a portable AED helped to save this man's life.
I was very fortunate, my family was very fortunate that they had an external defibrillator in this terminal, because if they didn't, I wouldn't be standing here today.
8 out of 10 major U.S. airlines have put defibrillators on board most flights, and federal regulators have proposed that all passenger carriers have them by 2003. And at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, defibrillators have already been placed on the walls so that trained airport employees can get to them in just 90 seconds. The reason for the growing presence of AEDs is simple. They can save lives that would otherwise be lost. An estimated 350,000 people who aren't in hospitals go into cardiac arrest each year. That's as a result of everything from heart attacks to drownings to dehydration. A stunning 95% die, mainly because they're not treated with AEDs. Carol Stemple is a registered nurse who trains people to treat cardiac arrest. We talked with her at one place that is now installing AEDs, the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington.
Normally, each of us has an electrical current that runs through our heart, and it is a nice regular pattern. And that regular pattern produces a contraction of the heart and gives us a pulse. Okay? In sudden cardiac arrest, frequently what happens to that nice electrical current is it becomes disorganized.
That disorganized current, called fibrillation, keeps the heart from beating effectively.
It's not regular, it cannot produce a contraction, and it cannot produce a pulse. So your victim has an immediate loss of consciousness, no breathing, no pulse. Essentially, they're what we call clinically dead.
Okay.
Only a defibrillator, which administers an electric shock to the heart, can restore the normal electrical pattern and make the heart beat regularly again. And there's not much time to intervene.
That very small window of opportunity is like 5 minutes or less. For each minute that goes by without defibrillation, we lose another 10% survival rate.
The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, a division of the National Institutes of Health, is concerned about the heavy toll taken by cardiac arrest. So along with the American Heart Association, it's launched a study to learn what would happen if AEDs were distributed more broadly. Under the $15 million study, defibrillators will be placed in roughly 1,000 public places around the United States and Canada.
Now it's telling me to stand clear, so you tell everybody, stay away, don't touch the patient.
To cut short the time it takes to treat victims with AEDs, thousands of non-medical personnel at those places will be trained to use them. Dr. Denise Simons-Morton, who oversees prevention studies for the Institute, says this strategy is what the study is mainly designed to test.
There are several different possible strategies. Only have them in emergency medical technicians' hands in ambulances, have them in first responders of police officers and firefighters, or put them in public places and have lay people trained in their use. We know the first two work from other studies. We're not absolutely convinced of what the results would be of putting the devices in public places and training lay people who are not medical people, training those people in their use.
Under the study, an estimated 2,500 to 5,000 volunteers will be trained in what heart experts consider the current standard of care for cardiac arrest. That means providing cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or CPR, to try to keep blood flowing around the body, and then calling 911 to summon emergency medical personnel. A separate group of volunteers will be trained in those procedures, plus the use of AEDs. Researchers will study what happens to cardiac arrest victims treated by each group.
So the question we're asking is, if you add AEDs to the current standard of care, is that feasible? Can you train enough people to do it accurately? And will it improve survival from cardiac arrest?
Registered nurse Carol Stemple thinks the answer will be yes. She says that's in part because today's AEDs actually talk operators through the procedure.
It is safe to touch the patient.
That makes them easy for trained lay people to use. At the Kennedy Center, we asked Stemple to demonstrate how an AED works. Nearly 30 are being installed throughout the building to be used by staff and security guards. The center's health and safety specialist, Randy Kennedy, played the role of a victim who suddenly collapsed with cardiac arrest.
Randy, are you okay? There's no response. I don't see any signs of movement. Susan, go call 911 and bring the AED. I'm going to open his airway. Look, listen, and feel. I don't see that his chest is rising or hear any breathing. AED's here. Thank you. Going to give him 2 breaths. Breathe. Good. And I'm going to apply the AED. The pads go to the right of the chest, just below the collarbone, and the other pad goes on the left side of the chest, about 2 inches below the armpit. One here, and one here. We'll turn our device on.
Apply pads to patient's bare chest. Plug in pad's connector next to flashing light. Analyzing heart rhythm. Do not touch the patient.
We don't want to touch the patient because the machine needs to do its analysis.
Shock advised. Charging. Stay clear of patient. Deliver shock now. Press the orange button now.
I'm clear, you're clear, everybody's clear.
Shock delivered. Analyzing heart rhythm. Do not touch the patient.
After a moment, the machine gave Stemple the go-ahead to proceed.
No shock advised. It is safe to touch the patient.
He's got a pulse.
If needed, begin CPR.
We'll stay here with him and wait for the ambulance to come. And in the meantime, we're going to leave our pads on because there's a very high probability that his heart could refibrillate, and the machine will let us know that, this device, within 4.5 seconds.
Sir, we have an unconscious man on mall level 2, glebe wing.
Although it's clear AEDs can save lives if properly used, other questions remain. For example, the study will evaluate the cost effectiveness of having the devices widely distributed in public facilities.
It's quite costly to put these devices in and also to provide the training. They cost $2,000 to $3,000 each now, and they need to be placed frequently enough so that you can, if you have a cardiac arrest, somebody can go get the device and come back within a minute or two. So, because time is of the essence. I mean, maybe for one building to do it, it would be feasible, but if you do it nationwide, this is a major cost.
Another question is whether non-medical volunteers can use even these simple-to-operate devices under extreme pressure.
Will they get confused as to how to use them? Will they feel comfortable opening a person's shirt?
If the answer is no, says Simons Morton, the volunteers trained to use AEDs could produce even lower survival rates than the other group in the study. But if AEDs in the hands of volunteers do save lives, the study will have shed light on how to close this gap in cardiac care.
People who don't make it to the hospital because of a cardiac arrest on the street or in their home is still a major public health problem. And public access defibrillation may be a real breakthrough in dealing with that segment of the population.
The study's results are expected to be made public in 2003.
Stop now and check and see if a pulse came.
Finally tonight, a lifetime in poetry. Elizabeth Farnsworth reports.
Stanley Kunitz took up his duties as Poet Laureate October 12th with a reading of his poems at the Library of Congress.
Lamplighter, 1914. What I remember most was not the incident at Sarajevo, but the first flying steam kettle puffing round the bend.
Kunitz was 9 years old when World War I broke out. He was already working, lighting gas lamps on the roads around Worcester, Massachusetts.
I stood on the rim of the buggy wheel and raised my enchanter's wand with its tip of orange flame.
That flame seemed a metaphor for the light Kunitz has cast ever since in poems which span the century. On this evening, he read deeply personal works, including one about his father's suicide.
My mother never forgave my father for killing himself, especially at such an awkward time and in a public park that spring when I was waiting to be born.
And he read works about World War II, the landing of men on the moon, and Halley's Comet, which Kunitz has seen twice. He is the author of 12 volumes of poetry, including the collected poems of Stanley Kunitz, which came out this fall. He has received the Pulitzer and Bollingen Poetry Prizes, a National Medal of Arts, and a National Book Award. He taught at Columbia and other universities, and was poetry consultant to the Library of Congress before in the mid-1970s. He has been a farmer and still at age 95 cultivates a large garden at his summer home in Provincetown on Cape Cod. He lives about half the year in New York City. I spoke to Stanley Kunitz at the Library of Congress. Congratulations on your new job. You've had this job before. Why did you take it at this stage of your life?
In the first place, I was terribly surprised that I was asked. And then I felt it really is a great honor. And then I was told that regardless of my age, I was qualified for the job, and I was happy to hear that. And then I was told that I would not have to spend a great deal of time traveling or performing, and I felt good about that. And then I felt that it was something that I could do have an impact in the reception of poetry.
You said actually once that you felt you were predestined to become a poet. What do you mean by that?
My family, fortunately, had an extensive library, And that was a rare phenomenon in those days. One of the prize volumes in that library was an unabridged dictionary. And I used to sit in that green Morris chair and open the heavy dictionary on my lap and find a new word every day. It was a big word, a word like eleemosynary or phantasmagoria, some words that were on the tongue, sounded great to me. And I would go out into the fields and I would shout those words because they were so important. They sounded so great to me. And then eventually I began incorporating them into verses, into poems. But certainly my thought in the beginning was that it was so much joy playing with language that I couldn't consider living without it.
Would you read a poem for us, please? Mm-hmm. And tell us a little about it before you read.
This is a poem I wrote in the 70s after I had lost several members of my family, my mother, my two older sisters, after I had lost as well several of my dearest friends in the arts. And it was a time when I felt I was ready for a change. I was ready to gather my strengths again and move in a new direction. And this poem came out of that, and I feel is central to my own work and my own life. It's called The Layers. I have walked through many lives, some of them my own, and I am not who I was, though some principle of being abides, from which I struggle not to stray. When I look behind, as I am compelled to look, before I can gather strength to proceed on my journey, I see the milestones dwindling toward the horizon and the slow fires trailing from the abandoned campsites over which scavenger angels wheel on heavy wings. Oh, I have made myself a tribe out of my true affections, and my tribe is scattered. How shall the heart be reconciled to its feast of losses? In a rising wind, the manic dust of my friends, those who fell along the way, bitterly stings my face. Yet I turn, exulting somewhat, with my will intact to go wherever I need to go, and every stone on the road precious to me. In my darkest night, when the moon was covered and I roamed through wreckage, a nimbus-clouded voice directed me. Live in the layers, not on the letter. Though I lack the art to decipher it, no doubt the next chapter in my book of transformations is already written. I am not done with my changes.
Live in the layers, not in the litter.
I must tell you how I got those lines. They came to me in a dream. In the middle of the night, I'd had this dream of a voice out of a cloud. And this is what the voice spoke to me.
Does that happen very often?
Dreams have given me many of my poems, yes.
What else gives you a poem? You've said that a poem is present even before it's written down.
Yes, I think a poem lies submerged in the depths of one's being. It's an amalgamation of images, often the key images out of a life. I think there are certain episodes in the life that really form a constellation, and that's the germinal point of the poems. The poems, when they come with an incident from the immediate present, latch on to those images that are deep in one's whole sensibility. And when that happens, everything starts firing at once.
And how have you kept in touch with that? How have you stayed so intellectually and physically vital all these years? You have a poem in this book that goes back to 1914.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
How have you done this?
Because I haven't dared to forget. I think it's important for one's survival to keep the richness of the life always there to be tapped. One doesn't live in the moment. One lives in the whole history of your being from the moment you became conscious.
The last poem in Kunitz's collected works is Touch Me, a love poem for his wife. He read its closing lines about crickets trilling underfoot during a late summer storm in his garden.
What makes the engine go? Desire, desire, desire. The longing for the dance stirs in the buried life. One season only, and it's done. So let the battered old willow thrash against the window panes and the house timbers creak. Darling, do you remember the man you married? Touch me. Remind me who I am.
Stanley Kunitz, thank you very much for being with us.
And thank you.
Again, the major stories of this Thursday. Governor Bush challenged Vice President Gore on his leadership and honesty. Gore said Bush was ignoring global warming. And there was word that at least 23 crewmen survived the initial explosions that sank the Russian submarine Kursk last August. We'll see you online and again here tomorrow evening with Shields and G Go, among others. I'm Jim Lehrer. Thank you and good night.
Imagine a system that produces and distributes food and helps improve nutrition and health here and abroad. Who is building such a global network?
Helping people with estate planning so that those they care about get more than a simple will can provide. See how we earn it. Solomon Smith Barney.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This program was also made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Video cassettes of the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.
Airtime for this unedited message from qualifying presidential nominee George W. Bush is provided by the Democracy Project and PBS member stations.
For 65 years now, Social Security has been a defining commitment between generations. It is the most successful social program ever undertaken by the federal government. Yet too often, Social Security's long-term problems have been ignored or exploited for political purposes. During the last 8 years, many opportunities for bipartisan reform have been squandered, leaving the system in danger of long-term insolvency. We are nearing Social Security's greatest test. 8 years from now, the massive baby boomer generation will begin drawing benefits, and within 2 decades, there simply won't be enough younger workers to pay the benefits earned by the elderly. If we do nothing to reform the system, it will one day reach a moment of collapse. I have a plan to save and strengthen Social Security for the seniors of today and for generations to come. It begins with a firm pledge. If you receive Social Security today and are close to retirement, nothing will change. You've earned your benefits. You've made your plans. And should I become president, we will keep the promise of Social Security. If you're a younger worker, my plan offers an opportunity where we'll give you the option of putting a portion of your payroll taxes into sound, responsible investments. This will mean a higher return on the money and a nest egg to help in your retirement. Real assets you can control and pass on to your children. Let me be clear, personal accounts are not a substitute for Social Security. Rather, they build on the promise of Social Security. They strengthen it, making it even more valuable for younger workers. There's a fundamental difference between my opponent and me. He trusts only the government to manage our retirement. I trust individual Americans to make their own decisions and manage their own money. The time for action is now. Can only be achieved through bipartisan leadership. I'll bring together both Republicans and Democrats. Working together, we will save Social Security and give our seniors the dignity and security that is their due.
The Democracy Project and PBS member stations provided this airtime for qualifying presidential nominees. Tomorrow, Democrat Al Gore